My name again is Emily Zayden. I'm the director of the Craft in America Center in Los Angeles, and I'm so pleased to have this talk by Blue McRight this morning. Thank you. Blue is an artist who works in various media. She studied at Evergreen State as well as RISD, and she's exhibited nationally and internationally. She's been a fixture in the Los Angeles art world since the 1980s, and she was a COLA, City of Los Angeles Master Artist recipient as well. And for today's talk, she'll be discussing work that is both recent, a bit of her more historical work, several works that relate to the Making Waves exhibition, pieces that are on view. And in addition to that, we'll be talking about her incredible studio that she co-designed with her husband, architect Warren Wagner, and we'll be talking about how they designed that space to be very sustainable. Throughout the talk, feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and then we will address all of those after she finishes the presentation. And we look forward to addressing all of that then. So thank you again, Blue. Take it away.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. I'd like to thank you all for coming to my talk today. It's great to see you virtually anyway. And I'd especially like to thank Emily Zayden and Joan Mace from the Craft in America Center for including me in the exhibition Making Waves and for hosting the talk today. I am water across various media, including painting, sculpture, installation, and public art. Water and its lack has been my primary subject matter for years. This image is called Untitled Spew, and it's an oil on sketchbook paper painting from 2010. Growing up on the East Coast and spending summers at the beach, my engagement with water has been a lifelong engagement. But I had a pivotal experience in the 1980s. I was working regarding water. I was working as a wilderness guide in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the mountains near there, when it suddenly became unsafe to drink water from the lakes and streams. It seemed like it happened overnight. The water was polluted. And that was a moment in my world where everything changed forever. Although I didn't focus on water as my main subject matter at that time, after I moved to Los Angeles in 1985, I was jolted by another significant experience when I saw Caltrans painting the sides of the freeway verges green with lawn paint because of a drought, and I knew I had to use that paint. It was clear that the lawn was a place where nature and culture collided, and as a wilderness person living in a big urban environment, I felt that same collision. In this arid region, such an insistence on an imported, inappropriate European landscape convention seemed completely incongruous. And at that point, my artistic practice and my environmental concerns converged. One day, I was washing the recyclables from my two-person household and decided to arrange and photograph each day's objects as a still life for 1 year as an homage to Giorgio Mirandi, one of my favorite painters who created stunning still lifes using common household objects. After the objects were photographed, I covered each one with artificial grass. From April Fool's Day 2004 to April Fool's Day 2005, I kept at it until by the end of the year, I had close to 900 objects, enough to make a lawn scale installation entitled Mirandi's Lawn. Mirandi's Lawn was shown at the Santa Monica Museum of Art in 2005, and again at the University of Alaska Anchorage and San Diego State University in 2009, which is where this photograph was taken. This installation was part of my 10-year survey exhibition, Blue McRight Elsewhere. And you can see a selection from some of the 275 still life photos on the back wall. In subsequent years, I created numerous paintings as well as sculpture and installations utilizing materials such as real and artificial grass, lawn ornaments, garden supplies, and the same paint that Caltrans used to paint the grass. A significant milestone in my exploration of the lawn was the exhibition Quench at Samuel Freeman in 2013, which is, this image is a photograph of the installation. The installation consisted of over 50 sculptures related to water and water distribution, including found objects such as vintage sprinklers and nozzles, garden and scuba diving equipment hoses, driftwood, and tree branches. Many of the objects were wrapped in black elastic bandages and tied with elaborate networks of thread and connected with black garden hoses to make a kind of a three-dimensional drawing. And here's a close-up of one of the objects in the installation. This is called Hot and Dry. It's from 2011, and it consists of tree branches wrapped in black elastic bandages, tied with thread, and hose hardware. This is Big Rainmaker, also a tree branch wrapped in black bandage and thread, as well as the scuba hoses, and attached to each other with hose hardware. And both of these works, as well as the next one, are from 2011. Here we have Well Wisher. For this piece, I used a rusty old hand water pump that I found and attached it to part of a dead tree trunk that I found, stood the tree trunk up on its branches upside down, and wrapped it in the black bandages and tied it with thread, and then attached vintage hose nozzles to the branch nubs and some of the branches. And this piece is in the Frederick Weissman collection here in Los Angeles. I'm fascinated by the extensive mythologies about water spirits, and in particular sirens, those powerful and deadly female figures that lure sailors off course and onto the rocks. The double meaning of the word enabled me to refer to that archetype, as well as sound an alarm about water and drought in this piece, Siren, from 2014. Sirens made from a found dead tree wrapped in the blue elastic bandages and tied with a network of thread. Its branches are tipped with vintage fire hose nozzles, they're bronze, and garden sprinkler heads. This image is from the exhibition the exhibition Antigone at Quotidian Gallery in 2019. I was awarded a City of Los Angeles COLA Fellowship for the 2015-16 grant cycle and created the installation Font, which is shown here at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery for the fellowship exhibition in 2016. Font on the left consists of almost 1,000 used books whose covers are colors of water: blue, green, gray, brown, white, and black. When you view it from a distance, Font resembles a large painting, but as you approach, you can read the text on the book covers, and all of the text relates to water in some ways. As you get closer and closer to the piece, you become immersed in it, and you start to read the titles at random, and it creates a prose poem for each viewer that's unique to them. On the right is the Book of Rain, which is made from a used book bound in the black elastic bandages and tied with threads that trail almost to the ground in reference to a meteorological phenomenon called virga, which is also known as walking rain. Old garden faucets protrude from a lot of the book's spines, And those are connected with garden hoses to each other and then to vintage sprinklers on the gallery floor. Font speaks metaphorically about modes of distribution and knowledge on a spectrum between fountains of enlightenment and the drip, drip, drip of misinformation. I started scuba diving in 2003, and being literally immersed in my subject matter changed everything once again. I mean, being immersed in that color is just amazing. My passion for the underwater wilderness has taken me all over the world. And in this image, I'm giving the double shaka, which means excellent. These are just a few of the amazing creatures I've seen underwater. The first one is a sea apple. This is an animal. It's an invertebrate, an amazing looking creature, about 11 inches long. Here we have a nudibranch. It's called a Halgarda Nudibranch. And in this photograph, it's deceiving because in real life, the animal is only about 1.5 inches long. But I blew it up so you could see the amazing form and texture. They are also invertebrates, and they creep along on the bottom, and the astonishing variety of color and form in the nudibranchs is just amazing. Here we have the Weedy scorpion fish. Yes, this is a fish. It's in side elevation. So you can see this is its snout and dorsal fin. Here's the tail. And it's just an amazing animal. The weedy scorpion fish are very, very wildly in their color and pattern and texture, and they're just exquisite. What I've witnessed and learned about the undersea world began to permeate and direct me and my artistic practice. This influence really started to take hold with the series Undescribed Variations. The title is a term used in marine taxonomy to classify what's been observed but not yet named. And a selection of 7 works from this series is currently on view at the Craft in America Center in the Making Waves exhibition. This photograph is a group of works from the exhibition Holding Up Half the Sky at Roberts Projects in Los Angeles in 2018. Undescribed Variations builds on the Quench series of sculptures by exploring their inverse. The nets of thread that form the elaborate surfaces of the previous sculptures have become unmoored from the objects. Instead of closely weaving a network of thread around a solid, these nets take their own shapes. They are the armatures, and they provide structure and meaning for each piece. The net armatures host diverse colonies of knots, lines, loops, lumps, and growths. And the materials include vintage cotton and plastic nets, tarred rope, waxed cord, jute, thread, felt, and various objects related to water. Nets allude to formal and narrative relationships to transparency, volume, loss, capture, and longing. They embody weight and weightlessness. And as a scuba diver, I understand weight and weightlessness intimately with my own body. Underwater, I'm without gravity, rising and falling on my own breath. This is Undescribed Variation number 1, a detail. And this piece utilizes a vintage canteen sling. I took the canteen out and set it aside and kept the sling, which is made of waxed cord, and then attached a lot of thread to that. And this is from 2018. Here we have Undescribed Variations number 13, also from 2018. And in this piece, the armature net is actually the cage from that used to enclose a glass fishing float. It's made of tarred rope. And I've attached little rings made of nylon nets and then festooned it with thread. And here we have Undescribed Variations number 14, also a detail. Excuse me. And in this piece is, you can see that it's one of the pieces where I started to not only attach things to the exterior of the nets, but to place things inside the nets so that you could see through this transparent skin to what was going on inside. As my passion for the ocean has grown, I've become aware of serious problems such as ocean plastic pollution. Taking part in beach cleanups with the Surfrider Foundation got me thinking about how to use plastic as a material for my artwork. And a couple of years ago, I began to collect plastic straws on my morning runs and everywhere I go. Although beach cleanups and personal gutter mining yield large amounts of straws and lids and other kinds of useful, to me and anyway, objects, I really hit the jackpot recently when my friend, artist Sierra Pêcheur, donated her trove of found plastic straws to me that she had picked up while walking along only a half mile of Venice Beach for the last year and a half. I mean, there are 6 huge bags of straws, so please don't use plastic straws anymore. In 2019, I was invited to participate in the exhibition Bridging San Pedro at Angels Gate Community Cultural Center. My project, Fathom, addressed the urgent problems of ocean plastic pollution as well as local sea level rise. I needed a lot of plastic trash for my project for the sculptures that I intended to make with community members, and I was working with the Surfrider Foundation when Angels Gate director Amy Erickson introduced me to Captain Charles Moore, a brilliant researcher, author, and waterman who discovered the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And here we are on his research vessel, Algeta. It turns out that Captain Moore had just returned from a research trip to the garbage patch, and he graciously donated some of his famous trash to my project. Through a series of workshops, the installation Fathom was created, and Emily and Joan are going to put up a link to a video about the project in the chat. And that was pretty much it. Although I had utilized found objects in much of my work for years, salvage and reuse has become the core of my message and practice since then, as you can see in this shot of part of one of my work tables, where you have straws, of course, lids, some dive equipment, random pieces of plastic and metal, and handles from other bait baskets, cords, spools from the nylon cord that you use in the whippersnipper, and on and on. This photo shows my current body of work, The Invisible Obvious, installed in my studio. The title is a metaphor for what is right in front of us, but unseen. And these pieces are fabricated almost entirely of salvaged and upcycled materials. As seen here and in Undescribed Variations, the organic processes of life, death, reproductive behaviors, and gender fluidity of marine creatures has inspired me to create a visual and metaphoric language in response to what I've seen and learned. I'm fascinated by creatures with clear bodies. One can see their guts, spines, reproductive organs, even their optic nerves and brains. It's amazing. This detail of sea-stack red spine from 2020 shows my thinking about that. The piece is an example of how many of my sculptures are informed by this physiological characteristic, with a central spine encased in and visible through nets or metal mesh, and in this case, salvage bait baskets. It's one of 4 sculptures currently on view in the exhibition Of Rope and Chain Her Bones Are Made at Craig Krull Gallery in Santa Monica. Works such as I Do It By Myself from 2021 on the left, consisting of used socks and bubble wrap, nylon nets and thread, and After the Gold Rush on the right from 2020, which is made from salvage nets and handles from the bait baskets from the Sea Stack red spine, as well as thread, also enable you to see within their bodies. Here's an example of a clear marine creature. This tiny fish, about 1 inch long, is a translucent coral goby, and indeed it is translucent. You can see the pattern of the coral that it's sitting on right through its body, as well as its optic nerves and guts, and this is about 1 inch long. In this photograph, we're looking at a Saurus body anemone shrimp, and this is its head end. These little red spots are its eyes, and here are its antennas. And if when you look at it, you can see that the body is perfectly clear, except for right here, you're looking right into its body at its eggs. And maybe that's what's happening here too. You may be looking at eggs, or who knows, but in any event, I Do It By Myself embodies ideas about self-fertilization and sexual ambiguity, both of which exist in abundance in the marine world and never cease to fascinate me. Here, a colony of tunicates is growing on the reef. These tunicates are pretty small, maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch long. Phenomena such as parasitism and encrustation, whereby organisms attach themselves to or even envelop their host or substrate, are often colorful and beautiful, but sometimes downright creepy, which is fabulous. The process of encrustation engendered encrustation mandala, which is a work in progress shown here in a detail that I'm making by wrapping a circular net removed from a crab trap with thread and cord. There's always competition for light and space on a reef. Animals live on top of, between, inside of, and next to each other in constantly changing, intricate layers. This is a detail of a piece called Things That Grow on Things from 2021, where salvaged ceramics, nylon nets, rope, and plastic objects, metal fasteners, paracord, and thread all jostle for position. And in this detail of the studio installation, you can see Things That Grow on Things, which is right here at the left. And on the right front, this piece right here is called Strobila, which refers to another a life cycle phase of jellyfish development. The Strobila is made from a salvage rope that forms its central spine, and then I've attached nylon nets and thread. Here you can see some of my favorite things in life, which are mooring blocks that sit on the ocean floor. They're big, heavy lumps of concrete that people tie their boats to. And these big blocks of concrete, these are probably 4 feet on a side, maybe a little bit bigger, come to host an amazing variety of life. In this case, in this example, we're looking at brain corals primarily that are growing on these concrete blocks, and they transform these geometric objects into these otherworldly kinds of sculptural shapes that I find fascinating. And in fact, when I'm diving with other people, sometimes I'll look around when we're near something like this and everyone else is photographing the fish and I'm photographing the mooring blocks. I love them. There's a lot of stuff on the ocean floor. There's all kinds of trash, bottles, shoes, and unbelievable things that you find down there. But there are many types of blocks and ropes that are still in use, or sometimes they're ghost objects that are just left there. but marine creatures love these things as habitat. And in this image, what we're looking at on the right-hand side is right here is a white painted frogfish. It's facing us. This is its mouth, eyes, and it's bracing itself in place with its with its fins, trying desperately to blend in with the white encrusting sponges that are growing on the ropes. And over here on the left, you see two more amazing creatures, ornate ghost pipefish, a male and a female. They like to float head downward and just kind of drift around. And in this picture, they're desperately trying to be inconspicuous. The dive live-aboard boat that we travel on in Indonesia is one of the most beautiful boats in the world. And it's called the Dewi Nusantara, which means goddess of the archipelago in Bahasa Indonesian. And not only is it a beautiful boat, but the rigging of the boat stuns me constantly because of its sculptural qualities. And here is an example of something I find so compelling, where there's a sail that's bundled up against the mast and tied with all these different ropes. And then there are other ropes behind it that are holding different parts of the rigging and different things onto the deck. Another piece of the boat rigging that I find to be amazing and inspiring is these beautiful block and tackles that hold the sails and the sheets of the boat. The boat rigging has prompted me to incorporate some elements of it in my work, like that block and tackle was one of my influences. In this piece, which is called Aquaculture from 2021, there's a hybrid of two nets, a cast net, which is this bottom piece, white, with lead weights attached to it all around the bottom, and a landing net, which is a black piece. And they're attached together and then held in balance and counterweighted by a strand of old plastic net floats that are strung on a salvage rope that runs through a rusty old pulley. Here's a close-up of aquaculture. You can see the lead weights that are attached around the bottom end of the net, and how that the two nets are tied and sewn and sutured together with thread. I search for and utilize used fishing nets, fish and crab traps, bait baskets, and other instruments of death. Though porous, they carry the weight of phantoms because creatures actually lived and died in these things, these objects that I'm using in my artwork. Here's a close-up of a bait cage and bottom net that I removed from a collapsible crab trap. And I used that bait cage to make this piece, Bait Purse from 2020, which consists of the bait cage and a handle from, again, one of the sea-stacked bait baskets. And then I tied red threads onto the piece. This piece, Lure, also from 2020, uses two tiny little bait cages. Each one of these, this and this, is about 3.5 inches long, as well as a lead fishing weight and two old shower curtain hooks and thread. And now I'd like to share a short video taken by my friend and internationally renowned underwater videographer, Anna Deloach. The video lets you experience moments from one of the most incredible phenomena of the natural world that occurs every night: the vast vertical migration of larval creatures coming up to surface waters from the deep sea where they live during the day. You enter the water in pitch darkness, and your dive light reveals trillions of tiny transparent animals zooming by you like a snowstorm in outer space. It is truly magical. And this, we're looking first at a larval anemone. Watch. This barracuda is a 1/2 inch long. Here's an unidentified open water squid, a 1-inch larval tube worm, a settling long arm octopus, this sea butterfly is 1/2 inch long. And here's a Larvacean mucus net with a tiny animal floating inside. Here we have a settling bent stick pipefish, 1.5 inches long. Amazingly, a 1-inch long larval wonderpuss octopus. And here is a young deep water glassfish sheltering in a jelly as they swim along. Amazing. The medusa life phase of jellyfish development is its mature phase, and I find that the variety of structures in jellyfish and their life phases to be amazingly interesting and inspiring. We Were Here and We Were Never Here is a piece from 2020 that refers to the medusa, and it's made from a salvaged metal bait basket, found straws, and thread. This piece speaks to the paradoxical condition of being present and absent simultaneously. The largest sculpture so far in this body of work, This Changes Everything, is currently in progress. Its title evokes not only those things in my past, those times in my past when I experienced something that was irrevocably transformed, but also to the present day crisis of microplastics that are everywhere in our environment. As shown, this piece is about 9.5 feet high by 11 feet wide, but I envision it becoming much larger. I want it to be a huge wall work that will dwarf the viewer. This Changes Everything consists of thousands of used clear, clear plastic straws that I found, washed, and tied together with red thread in an organic grid. The red threads coursing through and between the straws suggest the circulation of blood. Nanoplastics have the ability to and are crossing the blood-brain barrier in all living creatures. That's not supposed to happen. Nanoplastics affect cognition. They're making us dumber and dumber with every sip of water, every breath we take. This changes everything.
Thank you so much, Blue, for that taste of your work. We're going to, so I invite all of you to type your questions into the chat, which we'll come back to after we conclude. But we're being joined by your husband, Warren. Hi, thanks so much.
Hello.
And we're going to talk a little bit first about your space, which we see a bit of behind you. And it's quite beautiful. The lighting is wonderful. Could you tell us a little bit about the space and show us some features to start?
Okay. So this is an exterior view of the studio that Blue and I share. My architectural office is downstairs, and Blue's sculpture and painting studio is upstairs. The question of what makes a building sustainable is a large topic. But in the case of artist spaces in particular, and this one, we had the opportunity to design this building from the ground up as a passive solar building, very specific to the making of art upstairs and an office for making drawings and architecture and models downstairs. This building is designed in such a way with its orientation and with its placement of glass and the use of certain building materials to be a passive solar building, in that it uses the sun to heat and cool itself. And in this case, the design of the building itself accomplishes 90% of the heating and cooling of the building. we were able to tailor the design for each of us for what we do. The making of architecture and looking at computers and architectural drawings has a different lighting requirement than being a painter or a sculptor. So Blue Studio was naturally placed up on top where we could put skylights in and provide passive ventilation and good daylighting. And my space was on the bottom where the light requirements are a little bit less for computer screens and for more specific types of detail work. So that was a really important aspect of this particular building. What makes it sustainable is kind of a long story, but the main building features that we were able to do, because we started from the beginning, was to be able to orient the building properly to the sun and to be able to place the glass in the appropriate places and use overhangs to shade the summer sun out to keep it cool in the summer. I utilized a lot of we have a concrete floor downstairs, and the first floor walls are all made from concrete block, providing thermal mass, which helps keep this building stable both in the summer and winter. The pivoting doors you see on the front of the building are involved in the passive ventilation scheme for downstairs, where we open the back door and we open the front doors and let the air just come through to the degree we want. Upstairs, Blue has all her skylights are operable. So what you see behind us here in the daylighting is all operable. So she can open the door, open the skylights, and control the ventilation in the space. Daylighting, a critical piece of sustainable design, because we're reducing using artificial lighting in the daytime, and in new buildings like this, that's a kind of a no-brainer, especially for artists and painters. I know there are artists that don't like bright spaces. I know a computer artist in particular that I've done some work for, and that studio is very different with no skylighting or daylight. We've also been, we used an array of green building materials, from recycled denim insulation to zero VOC paint finishes in the building. The framing was engineered framing instead of from trees. And the entire building is powered by a solar photovoltaic electric system, 100%. So this is the system which is on our little house that powers our house, our studios, and my electric car. So 100% of the power used in our architecture and art studios is provided by the sun.
You want to talk about the hot water?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
There's a little piece in the corner here where there's some tanks that heat the hot water for our space.
It goes on and on and on. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, should I jump in with some questions, or do you want to?
Sure.
Okay. So it's just such an incredible example for artists out there who are looking at their studios and trying to make their spaces more eco-friendly. And Blue, your work, you synthesize the ideas that you're trying to express in the work, and obviously not strictly being an environmental message in your work, but you really, I mean, to create a space like this is just the ultimate in truly living to your words and intentions. So what an incredible partnership to have between the two of you. So I think there's probably people listening who are artists and who have questions about how they can make their spaces like this. Obviously, not everybody has an architect partner at their disposal, but I wonder, Warren, some ideas that you might have just at the outset for adaptable, without necessarily completely redesigning a space, where to begin, like what you think is the most critical. Is it the power source or something else?
Emily, it's a good question, but I think there's such a difference between owning and renting. So I know I've done artist studios, who are fortunate to have the opportunity to build something from scratch, or or own the building and can retrofit it, you know, buy a building, but they own it and they can retrofit it. So if you're trying to adapt a space, then there's many things that you can do. If you're trying to retrofit, you know, you can add skylights for daylighting, and you can add windows and to provide passive ventilation. You know, a hole in the roof is worth a lot for letting hot air out of buildings. And, you know, you can make that an operable skylight, and now we're venting it and daylighting it at the same time. One of the really easy things, and this is going to cross over into renters, LED lighting now provides us the ability to bring our energy bill for lighting, which is something artists are very fussy about and particular about. And in some cases use high energy lighting or low energy lighting, or, you know, whatever, but almost every type of light is now able to be an LED lamp. And that brings a building's energy usage from a significant amount of energy to almost zero for lighting. I mean, LEDs use such a small amount of lighting. So if you're retrofitting a space to work in, there are unbelievable array of good choices now, and which was when it wasn't always true, for retrofitting lighting to LED, cut your energy way, way down. I think, you know, again, for renters and people who are creating a space, the use of green building materials throughout the whole project can be as simple as zero VOC paint. Like if you rent a space, you can control the finishes in that space. You could also, you know, renters are unique, and a lot of artists start out renting spaces to work in. And I think what happens there is it gets personal. You know, how do you use your water in your space? I mean, you know, you don't own it, so you can't add that skylight, okay? But how do you use your water or reuse your water? What is it that you put down the drain as an artist? Because as Blue reminded us, it all goes to the ocean. And so, and artists use such an incredible array of materials and interesting things, but what do you actually put down your drain, or how do you dispose of toxic art materials and art waste? You can choose to use non-toxic cleaners. You can choose to use non-toxic paints. Do you use a lot of paper towels in your rented art space? Can you find an alternative to tree fiber based products? You could add window blinds to your space to control overheating in the summer. So renters are not at a loss for forwarding the sustainability of maybe not the physical environment, but certainly how they occupy it and use it.
That's super helpful. Yeah, thank you for thinking about that from that angle, which is probably really relevant to a large percentage of artists in this country, obviously. On that note, also, solar power, obviously, you're here in Venice, California. Light is abundant. Solar power is more accessible. Any words on that front of, you know, for folks who live in other states, the alternative power sources and how solar can be effective elsewhere? I know it's more challenging.
You know, Emily, on one hand, you're right, but frankly, photovoltaic systems can be used effectively everywhere. They can be laid flat on buildings. They perform in marginal sun conditions, even with indirect cloudy skies. So what's important to think about is that with today's LED lighting technology, you actually don't need to generate a lot of power to run it. You know, you don't need a big photovoltaic array. You know, art spaces are unique because they're not full of the kinds of things that houses are. Houses are packed full of functional design things like kitchens and bathrooms, and they have refrigerators and freezers and televisions and, you know, things. Art spaces tend to be simple. They tend to have basic needs of daylighting, controlling the daylighting, and you know, tend to be big spaces, but again, quite simple. And in my experience, much less fussy than homes. And artists are the ones who are open to using innovative materials and new green building materials in ways that others might not. So those things, together with the ability to kind of use this new technology for lighting, which can really happen, Emily, almost anywhere in terms of the use of solar power.
Yeah. Yeah, I invite anyone in our audience who in particular is in a craft medium where you do have certain equipment that is high energy consumption to pose any questions at this point, and we'll see if we can address them. And I do see some questions coming through. I wanted to mention also that we are producing an Artist Studio Eco Guide in conjunction with this exhibition. We'll put the information about that in the chat. We are collecting information from the public that will then be compiled and published as a tool on Craft in America's website. And so thank you so much, Warren, for giving us some really essential ideas as guide points. Shifting to Blue and your practice, that again is the embodiment of all of these ideas on so many levels in terms of looking at our environment. And we'll probably be, I think we'll shift back and forth between studio and practice, it looks like from the questions coming through. I would love to know more about process for you. And of course you use a variety of processes in your work, but knots come through repeatedly as a technique. And so what that process signifies, or any of the other techniques that you're using to you metaphorically or on any other levels, how you construct the work.
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, the work is made in cycles of repetition and improvisation, basically. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of knots being tied, but there's also, with all that repetition, there's an arc of improvisation that occurs between pieces and even within the same piece. I do a lot of sewing, also sewing pieces together, but it's mostly tying pieces together. And I started doing that in response to, years ago, in response to making public art where everything has to be solid and welded and, you know, durable for 20 years, or people rioting and jumping on the things, which has happened to me. And I wanted to, I responded to that by wanting to make things in my studio that I could make myself. And since I'm not a welder, I don't do that fabrication. I work with fabricators. What was available to me was very simple technologies of knotting and tying and sewing. And I've used those as the backbone of my practice. Wrapping, as I mentioned before, with the elastic bandages was a huge thing. Discovering that bandage was great because it's very difficult to cover an object with compound curves. And what are you going to use? So, well, one time I hurt my foot, and when I went to the doctor, he put this stretchy bandage stuff on me, and I thought, oh, that's it. And it comes in all these colors, but of course I wanted to use black, but you can wrap that stuff around anything. And what I found, what led me to the knotting, is that it doesn't stick longer than a few days. It starts to come undone. So I realized I had to tie it on there with, you know, hold it on there with, so it, in the early days of this process, like back when I was starting to make the work for the Quench series, I just had very simple tie networks of thread that were tying these bandages onto the objects, and then that didn't really work. They were starting to ruffle up, and so I became obsessed with it's not really crochet, it's a technique that I made up myself. It's kind of a weaving, my friend calls it a demented spider. It's kind of a combination of weaving and sewing that I make. And then that, it has engendered this whole way of working that once the nets came off these objects, I had all that information of how to do this, but I didn't need the object anymore. So I just started doing it in the air, and one piece leads to another, and they cross fertilize, and I frequently cannibalize older work, take it apart and use different parts in newer work. And I'm very concerned with thoughtful about what's concealed and what's revealed. And that's a metaphor that's inherent in the materials. Just there's so much metaphor embodied in the materials. Just to use what's wasted and overlooked and neglected is a total metaphor. So I feel like the content of the work is embodied in the materials in a really deep way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the nature largely of your work. So yes, that idea, you're not looking at fishing nets and traps and recreating any of those nets and knots per se in the work, or you feel like you just kind of absorb those patterns and then have recreated them in your language in the work, but it's not any kind of literal referencing to traditional fishing knots per se.
No, the knots, I have a giant book, the Ashley Book of Knots, which I bought and promptly ignored in favor of making up my own way of tying the knots. And it's just a very simple technique. So it works for me. I'm not interested in any kind of illustrative approach in using the materials. I want to transcend the found objects that I'm working with. It's a tension between their beauty and their inherent cruelty. The fact that creatures actually died in these things imbues them with an edge that, I mean, beauty can also be very savage. Beauty is not pretty. Those are different things. And yeah, I would say the cruelty that's inherent in these materials, these instruments of death that I've removed from the sea, or I haven't removed them, but they've been removed from the sea where they can't hurt anything anymore. That's part of the content of the work, a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, you're not, even though it's an inherently political message of protecting the underwater world in a lot of ways, that's not, your immediate agenda isn't there. But I do wonder, or isn't, it is balanced by your poeticism and the personal messages, I think, as well. But I wonder your view overall of how art can convey those messages, and what you feel your part is in presenting all the issues that we have on the ecological front. How you see it going from your piece to the viewer to, is there something beyond that?
I've always been, well, I should say I've never been interested in being didactic in my work. I've always been more interested in being poetic. And I still have that as a priority. But as I mentioned in my talk, with my increased involvement with and awareness about the ocean and these problems, I realized that I have to step up and be more of an activist than I envisioned becoming, even as recently as a few years ago. And that's why I make these deliberate choices about the materials that I'm using and their origins. And I make no apology for having a message, because I feel like it's crucial. And as my friend and hero, Captain Moore, has pointed out, artists are so important in the process of raising awareness about ocean plastic pollution, because by virtue of the fact that they're willing to engage with this waste material, which can be and must be viewed as an abundant resource, not just garbage, because that's old news. We have to view it as having value. Artists pry open a space by using this material. They pry open a space where this trash can enter the realm of cultural dialogue. And I insist that this plastic trash can be beautiful as material for artwork, that it's important, that it's metaphoric. It forces us to confront what's overlooked and wasted. And as much as I want my work to be poetic, and I believe that it is, and allude indirectly to all these influences that I've mentioned in my talk, I do feel like more of an activist than I have been, and that I thought I would be, because I do have this message that is at the core of my practice now. And I feel like artists are uniquely positioned to do both. They can raise awareness about issues and still preserve a poetic force that keeps the work, keeps it artwork and doesn't turn it into some kind of poster or, you know, whale made out of plastic lids. Or not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not what I'm interested in. And what I've found since I've been doing this body of work is that there's an incredible audience that I'm reaching. I'm reaching people from the fish world. I'm reaching people from the craft world, from the fine art world, if there's still a distinction between those two things, which that's a whole nother discussion, but I don't buy that anyway. And the audience is broad. People want to engage with this idea, and I feel like it's really important.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the comments that's come through, and we've talked about microplastics and ocean debris, the other issue of overfishing, and since your life is this embodiment of what your beliefs are, wondering about what you think as far as food and food sources in terms of fishing in the ocean. Any statement on that front?
I'm not an expert on this topic, but from what I do know, I would say that there's no such thing as sustainable commercial fishing. I've seen reefs all over the world that are devastated. The shark population worldwide is dwindled to a tiny fraction of what it was because of shark finning and these obscure and ridiculous practices of overfishing on a commercial scale. The ocean is so huge. It's so very difficult to regulate these fleets that are out there. I do believe that sustainable fishing practices are possible on a small scale. Indigenous people all over the world have shown us that that's true, and there's a lot to be learned from that. I'm concerned, though, about not only overfishing, but the fact that a lot of the ghost nets, which is abandoned fishing gear, they call it ghost nets because it's just floating out there all alone. Many times when commercial fishing boats are about to come back to their harbor, they'll throw their nets overboard and just, because it's more financially lucrative for them to fill that space with catch than it is to bring the nets back. They'll throw that money away on the net, and just, that's a lot of the reason why there's so much of, and some of these nets are huge. I mean, the size of a football field. They're gigantic. Right. And they're out there floating around, killing things. It's just horrible. So it's not just overfishing, but it's also the problem of discarded fishing gear that's associated with the fishing industry. That's a big, big problem.
Yes, exactly. And I think that ties in with your idea of cruelty, that in adapting the materials that you do.
Yes.
It's very much something that comes through. Joe Loria has asked, to what degree labor figures into your practice and work being valued or not valued by the amount of time invested in process, what your view is on that.
I guess it depends on who's doing the valuing. For myself, I value that work, that time spent in process. Sometimes I feel like an octopus because they have brains in their arms, and I feel like my arms have a brain. Each one of my arms has a brain, and that the work of my hands guides me. It's my hands are thinking for me. And if I didn't make things, I wouldn't be able to make things, if that makes any sense. Yes, the hours, besides keeping me sane, because it keeps me focused on what matters to me instead of distracted by the craziness of and the sadness and grief and anger of the world. The labor of making is something I've been involved in my entire career. I'm one of those. I mean, look at Mirandi's lawn. Oh my God. Covering those 900 objects with artificial grass. It took me 1.5 years. Why do you think I started on April Fool's Day and ended on April Fool's Day? Okay, there's a reason for that. I'm well aware of the folly of deep labor, but I'm completely committed to it. And I don't know how it's valued. You know, I think it just depends on who you're asking, but for me, it's everything.
Thank you. We are coming to a close, but I wanted to ask you and Warren as well some thoughts about how artists who would like to echo this idea of the total embodiment of your work that you've achieved here in the space as well. Other resources, are there any particular online websites for other architects, firms, coalitions nationally to look at, and anything else you would say as a starting point for folks across the country?
Well, if I may, just from a kind of resource standpoint, I think if an artist or anybody is actually serious about and going to invest the resources to build something for themselves, of course, hiring an architect with the background to help them in these sustainable issues is a good way to go. There are also now a lot of very educated and smart design build firms, which is a notch down in finances from hiring an architect and a builder, that can also help people. But I think I would encourage, the most important thing I think would be to encourage people to look locally for their resources, to find someone in their area who knows their area and can help them locally, as opposed to a kind of broad net website for the whole country, or a design website like House or Pinterest, or these things that are useful in the design world. I encourage people to reach out more locally to architects or builders in their direct area who have experience doing things for artists.
Okay, that's helpful, and probably makes also sourcing materials more sustainable, keeps it very local on that front. Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Yes, again, your work is the embodiment of this idea of connectivity, and you're really truly living that. And so thank you to both of you for contributing to this conversation. That's so important. Thank you so much, Blue, for all of this insight into your work.
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to be in the exhibition and to give this talk.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.